Finn McKenty, the punk rock MBA, is full of hot takes. Some of them I agree with, some of them I don't agree with. But one thing I agree with is the fact that Finn is honest, genuine, says it how it is. Even though I don't agree with him, I still respect the fact that he is really honest with what he says. Now, he did put out a video almost 2 weeks ago called The Problem with Metalcore. And I figured, as someone who covers all of metalcore, what better way to discuss Finn's video and see if I agree or disagree with him?
Do people actually listen to like metalcore? Like, I don't believe that like you enjoy that.
Starting strong.
I've been listening to metalcore since the very beginning of the genre way back in the 90s, and contrary to what people on Reddit say about me, I actually love the genre. At its best, metalcore combines the aggression and energy of punk and hardcore with the precision and heaviness of metal, which should be obvious from the name, right? Like, it's metalcore, metal plus core. But in my opinion, that is exactly what's wrong with metalcore these days.
He's really going after Invent Anime, man. So, as someone who's had criticisms about Invent Anime, the fan base is intense. I think Invent Anime is probably one of the most passionate fan bases. Prog metalcore fans are so passionate. I disagree with him if he's going to say metalcore is bad and then he's putting a clip of Without a Whisper. Wrong. This song is fucking beautiful, okay? But he hasn't mentioned the song yet. But to use the clip of this,
It's completely lost any connection to its roots in hardcore, which is a little bit weird considering that the people who actually created the genre back in the 90s were actually all from the hardcore scene. It was originally an outgrowth of hardcore, but that is no longer true. And personally, I think that's the reason why the genre has lost a step in the last 5 years or so. And in my opinion...
So, okay. We're already starting off with a very spicy take that the last 5 years have been like, lackluster for metalcore. But I have the opinion that the past 5 years have been awesome for metalcore. It's getting more commercially successful with Spirit Box getting like Grammy nominated. I feel like the 2010 to 2020 era was like the Risecore era. I think that's when metalcore was a lot less interesting. But I feel like the past 5 years we have like Loathe, which is like bringing the shoegaze, and shoegaze is all over metalcore lately. Sleep Token has some metalcore elements for sure, with the emphasis on breakdowns, and look how big they are, right? So yeah, we're already starting off with some hot takes.
Opinion, it's become kind of safe, stale, and bland. And in this video, I'm going to explain exactly what I mean and talk about why I think that's vital to the overall health of the genre. And I fully expect this to end up on r/metalcore with a bunch of comments about how much I suck and how wrong all my opinions are. But at this point, I'm very used to that, so let's just do this. And
it's true. I find Reddit and Twitter to be some of the toughest people. All it takes is like one person to say something negative, and then they'll go like, yeah, you know what, I agree with you, I'll upvote you, and then all of a sudden it becomes like an echo chamber of just people talking shit. So I feel for Finn. He gets a lot of hate on Twitter.
Also, this video is sponsored by Helix, so much well as Big and Tall Sleepers.
Oh wait, Helix mattresses? Damn, I want that sponsor. I could really use a new mattress.
Which can check out take
that's a long ad.
/punk rock to find out more about this limit, which is that metalcore came from the hardcore scene. Period. Full stop. First, there were bands like Earth Crisis, Ringworm, Marauder, Integrity, Starkweather, and so forth, who really took hardcore in an overtly metal direction, drawing more musical influence from bands like Sepultura, Slayer, Prong, and Carcass than they did from Minor Threat or Black Flag.
The genre would be dead if certain bands don't exist and aren't evolving and incorporating different sounds and genres. So that's something, I always mention, is just like implementing different genres has been a great gateway of getting non-metal heads into the genre by infusing like R&B. Also, I do have the opinion where, there's so many bands that sound the same in metalcore, which is a common criticism that I also say all the time. Hell, I even made a similar video talking about how do we fix metalcore, because I agree with Finn that a lot of modern metalcore can be kind of boring. It's very samey in terms of cliches and tropes, but there's always outliers, and that's what I talked about in my original video, was the criticisms, but then also focusing on the bands that are doing innovative things. And that opinion still holds true today that I have, is that there are 10%, not an actual accurate number, but 10% of bands are doing innovative things where the other 90% sound very similar to one another. So how do we fix the 90% of metalcore is something that I was kind of talking about in my original video. But competition breeds innovation too. So with the 100 metalcore bands out there, at least one of them will completely do something completely different to stand out from the pack, right? So as convoluted it is, there's always going to be outliers.
They still played shows at VFW halls, they printed their own merch, lots of these bands self-released their own music, and their lyrics were either about social and political causes in the case of,
I gotta admit, I never listened to much Earth Crisis. I know they're influenced,
personal issues like And I think the problems with metalcore really started in the late 2000s, when all the Myspace metalcore bands like Asking Alexandria, I See Stars, Of Mice and Men, and The Devil Wears Prada blew up.
This is where it got problematic. It's funny because he mentioned a lot of bands, which are the bands that made me lose interest in metalcore, except for Devil Wears Prada.
And to be clear, I think those are all great bands and I like them a lot, but they were fundamentally different from the Killswitch generation of bands. The biggest thing here was that they no longer had any kind of connection to hardcore. And I remember how a lot of these bands would mention like Linkin Park and Under Oath as influences, and that they didn't really have any idea who Madball or Black Flag were. And again, I want to be clear, this is not gatekeeping on my part. I don't think that they have any obligation to know who Madball or Minor Threat or Black Flag are. It was just something that I didn't expect, because
I am kind of the same. I'm the metalcore kid that actually didn't listen to the old hardcore bands. I'm not a big hardcore person, so I actually resonate with a lot of the same bands. Under Oath and those bands were like my influences too. It's hard to argue, like, are those bands really, metalcore? A lot of the bands that I were influenced by was more punk and post-hardcore-y, I guess, rather than Hatebreed and all those bands.
Because it was like, oh, these bands sound kind of like hardcore, but they have no idea what hardcore actually is. This is interesting. But still, I did like this stuff, because even if they weren't directly influenced by punk or hardcore, they still had a lot of that same kind of sensibility. As far as it being a scene made up primarily of teenagers or people in their early 20s, making music for other young people, they really didn't give a fuck about what the old people thought the supposed rules of music were.
Now, got a question though. Were these bands really considered metalcore back in the day? Like, did you guys use the term metalcore a lot back in the early 2000s? Because I feel like I didn't really say things were like metalcore. You did? Yeah. I didn't know what I was listening to be completely honest. I think metalcore, the term metalcore, is way more prominent now than it was in the early 2000s. I think it's a much more used term now. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, dude. That's what people call it. They call it screamo.
And for the most part, the bands were pretty chill, accessible people who didn't really take themselves too seriously. And notice that I said for the most part, because that was not always the case. There were some people like Maddie Mullins from Memphis May Fire and Austin Carlisle from Of Mice and Men, who definitely did take themselves very seriously and sometimes pulled some kind of rock star stuff.
My school counselor pulled me aside one day and she said, Maddie, I don't see a lot of direction from you. What is it that you want to do in your life? And I said, well, ma'am, I'm going to be the voice of a generation.
If you guys have heard Matty Mullins say that, he's definitely notorious for saying that. But I feel like this is also the era when these bands realized that they were able to spread positivity, right? Leaning some towards like being vulnerable and sensitive.
Exactly where I started to think, you know what, maybe we do need the punk and hardcore influence in metalcore. Because yes, punk is shitty and toxic in a lot of ways, as I've talked about in many other videos. But the part that I do love about punk, and I think is really special and important for us to keep, is that there's basically zero tolerance for any kind of rock star shit. But this era is when metalcore started to kind of lose that. So as much as I did think the Myspace era of metalcore was generally cool and fun, and I liked a lot of these bands, this is where I think the genre started to kind of get on shaky ground because they lost that connection to punk and hardcore.
It's funny because like that's when I like lost interest in metalcore, where I felt like metalcore just got generic. I didn't really see it as in terms like losing like the punk element and the hardcore element. I understand what he's saying, but I guess for me, I just felt like sonically the way that the music sounded just started to get more generic. The crabcore, chuggy bands and the heavy use of synthesizers when I just lost interest in metalcore.
So heavy that it feels like
And
Is that wait? Did he just play Void of Vision? Did I miss that? Watch them live, bro. Void of Vision puts on an insane show live. I was very, very impressed when I saw him live.
again, just to be totally clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, and I'm not here to gatekeep or tell anybody what they should sound like. So please understand that my point here is not to try to force hardcore on people because that's what I liked when I was 16 years old. My point is that I genuinely
The amount of times like, try not to gatekeep, but I'm slightly gatekeeping a little bit.
like, if you compare the song that I just played to the early 2000s era when Killswitch, Parkway Drive, God Forbid, Shadows Fall, and so forth were defining the genre, to me, the new stuff is missing a couple things. For one, the groove of hardcore, like I mentioned before. Like those kind of old school metalcore breakdowns that made you just like want to nod your head or mosh. Those were replaced by the Meshuggah style of breakdown, which are an appeal to the more, I guess you could say, intellectual side of your brain, where
Yeah, but also we still have those like hardcore breakdowns too, like Kublai Khan. A lot of people like consider them like pretty much in the metalcore side of things too. Jesus Peace too. Knock Loose is a little bit more on the technical side, but we have a lot of bands that are bringing back that hardcore style. So I don't necessarily agree with this. I think the modern metalcore has so much diversity that if you're someone that wants the OG hardcore sound, you can easily find it. There's so many bands doing it, like the ones I mentioned, but if you guys in the chat can name even more. Throne, exactly. Throne's another one. Like, it's there. But also, like he's saying, yeah, there's the intellectual ones, the Invent Animate era fans too. It's just, that's what I love about metalcore today, is that it's so broad with bands. Boundaries too. Boundaries is old school. Oh man, Boundaries. That album is so good. If Finn has not heard the Boundaries record, he needs to hear it. Revival core, yeah, there's a lot of revival core bands. Those are more like not hardcore leaning, more like post-hardcore, screamo. But yeah, there's that too happening.
where the goal isn't to make you move, it's to impress you, the listener, with like how intricate and technical it is or how low they tune. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. But again, my point is that I think it's lost something creatively, specifically that it's lost a lot of the emotional range that the genre used to have. Like, no disrespect to modern bands like Imminence, Invent Animate, or Currents, but to me, I just feel like there's so much less emotion in stuff like this.
There it is. There it is. The spiciest take of all. Oh man, it's the thing is I understand where Finn is coming from. I understand where Finn is coming from because I've been critical about the bands that he mentioned. I've been critical about Imminence. I've been critical about Invent Animate. And you know what's weird? I'm friends with both of those bands now. That's one of the coolest things about the metalcore scene is that I find a lot of the bands can take criticism that I have but are still cool with it. But where he's getting at, where it lacks emotion, it's all subjective to the listener. Finn, you know, he's in his 40s now. Obviously, you know, age does make a difference in terms of how you listen to music, right? And that's how I felt about older Invent Animate, and it still holds true to a lot of their records, where a lot of the screaming pitch doesn't really resonate with me because this is going to sound so boomer, but like if I was in my early 20s or in high school, it'd probably resonate with me a lot more. But I do feel like Without a Whisper connected with me. Maybe it's the falsetto vocals, the chord progression, the shoegaze undertone, and the guitars. It spoke to me, but again, that's maybe because of my experience and where I'm at. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the emotions that these bands convey is all up to the listener and the listener's experiences. So with Finn, you know, he's definitely a bit in the older side of things, and there's nothing wrong with that, but also because of his experiences and how hardcore resonated with him a lot more, it's so subjective. Because hardcore music doesn't really make me have too much emotion. I understand that it appeals to people, but it doesn't really resonate with me too much all the time. Pineapple on Pizza definitely knows this. So this is the spiciest take. I disagree with him, but I understand where he's coming from. And it's funny that the bands that he mentioned are also the bands that I've been critical about: Imminence, Invent Animate, and Currents, which is really funny. So even though I disagree with him, I understand where he's coming from because, again, we're almost on the same page. We're almost there.
compared to the first generation of metalcore like this.
Finn makes a good point here using this Pure Hatred as example. It's a very aggressive, true metalcore song where Invent Animate Without a Whisper is not metalcore, but it's from a metalcore band. I think using the example False Meridian from Invent Animate would have probably been a better example that encapsulates what metalcore is about.
To me, the current incarnation of metalcore feels more like music by guitarists for guitarists, where it's more about string gauge and time signatures and impulse responses.
I simply disagree here too, because in the 2000s, it was guitar-focused music too. You know, we had As Lay Dying, All That Remains, The Human Abstract, I can go on, where it was more focused on the riffs, or the riffs were at least more memorable than, you know, the chorus or certain other aspects of the song. You know, we had a lot more guitar solos back in the day too, where today, modern metalcore is absent with a lot of guitar solos. It's more focused around like pitch shifters and, again, the string gauges like he was talking about, but that was important too in the 2000s. So my point is that I think since the 2000 era, it's always been guitar focused music.
Then it is creating these kind of like broadly appealing, memorable songs full of emotion.
So it's funny because I totally agree with his point, but then he uses Invent Animate Without a Whisper. Invent Animate is a band that I feel like focuses on time signatures and technicality, where the band is capable of more, and then they really showed that off with Without a Whisper. Without a Whisper is not really a technical song. Instead, they really stripped down and made a much more basic song, yet it's their best song, according to like my personal opinion. It's their best song, and it's one of their most simple songs. So what he's just saying there, and then Without a Whisper, I just don't agree.
Now, I will say that there are some notable exceptions to this. For example, I think Bad Omens are a great band with some incredible songwriting. And as far as I'm aware, they don't have any like roots or influence in hardcore, so I don't think that's a requirement to make good metalcore. And beyond the
because Bad Omens is cum metal.
Musical side of things, I think we've also lost something as far as the message. And I'll admit that I'm a very literal person, so reading between the lines of metaphor is definitely not my strong point. And it's possible that I'm missing something, but to me, I'm not really sure that most of the metalcore bands these days are really trying to say anything at all. Or if they are, it's so buried in like symbolism and metaphor that it's totally unclear. And again, there's...
You know what? I actually kind of agree with him actually a little bit. Like a lot of the lyrics and symbolism in metalcore is probably my least favorite aspect about this genre. Like that's why you don't see me talk about the lyrics too much. And now he's probably going to be talking about exceptions, and an exception to the rule is Silent Planet. They're a band that has so many interesting like references to literature and biblical references that it's just so intriguing. But yeah, I find like a lot of metalcore music is a little bit surface level in terms of the themes and topics that it covers, for me personally.
There's some exceptions. For example, Garrett from Silent Planet, I think, is someone who has a very clear point of view and expresses that. But for the most part, I think these bands are really just sort of going through the motions, and if anything, trying their hardest not to say anything because they don't want to rock the boat. Now compare that to two of my favorite people who did come from that OG metalcore era back when it was still an outgrowth of the hardcore scene. One being Doc Coyle from God Forbid and now Bad Wolves, and the other being Phil Labonte from All That Remains and formerly Shadows Fall, who are both very vocal about their opinions on Twitter, both disagree with each other on almost everything, and yet are still very good friends with each other.
Yeah, that's something I like. They're both very different on like the political spectrum, but they're both civil and level-headed, and that's an interesting point that I made.
It's true on just a sort of aesthetic level too. Like when you look at the promo photos of most of these modern bands, literally nothing stands out, because all these photos are just sort of the guys standing in a room looking serious in black t-shirts, and all the videos are just them playing gent riffs in a room full of colored LED lights.
I completely agree with Finn here. I think the visual aspect in music videos, also a lot of like the photos that these bands take are all so similar and generic. None of the music videos really try doing anything too different. It's usually them in front of a warehouse with strobe lights like he was saying. But I think another caveat is like the CGI music videos with the green screen background is getting very, very generic to me. AI music videos is another thing too. So I do think we need a lot more innovation in terms of the visual aspect of metalcore bands. I truly believe Bring the Horizon broke the code with Step Eternal into a more mainstream sound. The metalcore bands then thought they were niche, realized they can make actual money, so they all adopted their stance more mainstream taste. It happens a lot. So yeah, Bring the Rise and Sempiternal is definitely one of the most turning point like records. It's basically Linkin Park on metalcore, and that's pretty much been the basis to a lot of bands. Not all the bands, but a lot of bands have followed that kind of style. Bring the Horizon is one of the best bands in the scene because they take these styles, but since they're already established and commercially successful, they can make it accessible for other bands to make money through it too. And you got to, like, bands are also businesses. They're not just creating art. If they want to sustain and make money and continue doing a living off this, they have to adapt to certain trends. And if Bring the Horizon is that band that adapts to trends and say the show's like, hey, it's okay to do this, then it's cool. So Bring the Horizon going into Ammo, which a lot of bands started like getting more into pop. Bring the Horizon doing even their newest record. Like, I feel like the newest record is actually not the most forward thinking because revival core is already kind of happening in a way. But you know what I mean, right? They're just a forward-thinking band. And another example is Sleep Token. Sleep Token, you know, they have a lot of haters, but they're also doing something that's completely different than other bands. And guess what? Now they're huge and making a lot of money from it. Now bands are realizing it's okay to be sexy. It's okay to incorporate R&B into your music. So it's okay to go slow before a breakdown or something. And now I'm hearing a lot of Sleep Token influence in a lot of bands. So yeah, that was just a good point that you made about Sempiternal.
Land. It's almost like these bands make a deliberate effort specifically to blend in with each other. They look the same, they sound the same, they write.
It's funny how he's using Dreamwake as an example. Dreamwake is a band that I think are like, they're cool. They do sound the same as majority of other bands. And I know a lot of people in the chat will disagree with me because I know there's a lot of Dreamwake fans. The thing that this band has is that they have this 80s retro neon look, and it's really cool. The visual aesthetics of this band is awesome. They're so distinct on a visual standpoint, but sonically, they sound like most metalcore bands to me. And if they could incorporate more 80s style and retro into their music, I think they would sonically just be way more distinct.
Write the same lyrics about being caught in the undertow or whatever, whether it's because they're actually afraid to do something different or they're just uninspired, I couldn't tell you, but the net result is basically the same. Metalcore now is at the same place that like the Myspace generation of metalcore was in maybe like 2011 or 2012, where the whole like crabcore sound was just absolutely completely saturated and played out, but more and more bands started cropping up, and it was only a matter of time before it collapsed under its own weight. Now, whether all of this is a good thing or not depends on who you ask and what you want from the genre, which kind of gets back to what I was saying at the beginning of the video. And I think this is why metalcore bands now try so hard not to stand out in their promo photos. It's also why they try not to say anything too outlandish on social media and more or less sound the same as every other band in the genre, because the everyman specifically doesn't want to be different. And so I think that's really what it is. Metalcore is no longer a subset of the hardcore scene. It's now a subgenre of metal. And for better or worse, it seems like that is exactly what the world wants it to be. And so the question that I want to ask myself is, well, what's wrong with that? Is that even a problem? Because as much as that might be a disappointment to me personally, it seems like this is exactly what the fans and the industry want. They seem to love where the genre is now, and I think the numbers support that. Like, as much as I'm not necessarily crazy about the bands in this generation, the fact is that metalcore is for sure in a better place now than it was in maybe like a decade or so, if not more. So I really think it just comes down to what you value. Do you value innovation, questioning things, and bucking the trends while also not taking yourself too seriously? If you do, that is the rebel archetype. And if you're one of those people like me, well, then you're probably a little bit sad to see the punk and hardcore influences leave metalcore. But on the other hand, maybe you value something a little bit closer to the everyman archetype. Bands who prefer to sort of color within the lines of the genre, not rock the boat too much in terms of how they look, act, or what they say, and focus more on the riffs than any kind of message. And if that's what you value, well, then you're probably happy to see metalcore become a little bit more like metal and a little bit less like hardcore. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those who...
Okay, Editor Burb here, and it's because I want to sum up my thoughts in a more coherent manner than I was on my live stream. And with Finn, I actually agree with a lot of his sentiments. You know, I've been critical about metalcore too. I've made a lot of criticisms. I've made commentary videos on how modern metalcore is boring. But I do want to reiterate the fact that, I feel like 90% of metalcore bands all sound the same. They're playing it safe. And then it's 10% of them bands that are the outliers. And again, competition breeds innovation. Those 10% bands that are pushing the boundaries of what metalcore can be are the ones that are making it more commercially successful, experimental. We got Spirit Box, we got Bad Omens, we got Loathe, we got so many bands. And if Finn wants those hardcore adjacent bands, they're there. Kublai Khan, Jesus Peace, Boundaries, Throne. Boundaries is probably more on the metalcore side of things, but like Knock Loose, again, more on the metalcore side of things. But if he really wants that true OG sound, it's there. It's just more niche. And that's because metalcore has evolved. It's becoming almost its own thing that maybe metalcore, the term, doesn't even apply anymore, because we got the butt rock bands like Wage War, Memphis May Fire that almost just sound like hard rock bands at this point with like the breakdowns. But the point is, I think metalcore right now is at one of the healthiest times it's ever been, because again, it's getting more radio friendly, commercially successful, but then you still have that raw OG sound too. It's so diverse, and so many people can get into the scene. Now, I do agree with him that it's missing what made the genre so special. It's missing that raw edge and something to stand for. Those bands are there. They're just hard to find, but they're there. And I feel like those bands that he mentions, it's better to use the term metallic hardcore than metalcore, because metalcore is almost its own thing now. So overall, I totally agree and disagree with a lot of things that Finn says. Finn is someone that I respect because he actually is very honest with what he says. He doesn't have the general consensus opinions, which you see online everywhere, where people just pander to their audience and say safe opinions. Finn is an independent thinker, which I really respect about him. So he says it how it is. And because of him being an independent thinker is where I like to come in and maybe chime in and agree or disagree with a lot of his points. So I think this was actually a good video with a lot of valid criticisms. I just wanted to disagree and insert that I think metalcore is doing pretty damn well, even though I'm bored by 90% of the metalcore. And man, I hear a lot of metalcore in my streams, and you don't see me featuring those bands all the time because I go through a lot of rough stuff to find those hidden gems, and those hidden gems are the ones that I want to push on the channel. So again, it's all about the outliers, and those outliers is what's making metalcore alive and well, in my opinion.